I developed this talk really targeted at the research community. So this is being presented to the other side of the coin, if you will. And I put this together largely in response to the question I receive most frequently when I tell people what I do: why do you do that? Right? Why, explain yourself. Why do you work with, as Annette referred to, people, key populations? Why do you work with people who are at the highest risk for contracting or transmitting HIV? And I got tired of my answers. So I never really thought about it too hard. So this is really a discussion of my own personal journey of how things came to be. We all travel a different path to arrive to this point in time. This is some take on the path I took to arrive at this point in time. I'm used to doing this in 5 minutes, so I got to learn to slow down. It was developed as a 5-minute talk. So Stevie Wonder tells us that music is a language that we can all understand, right? When we meet somebody, we ask them, what music do you listen to? It's one of the most common openers, if you will. It gives us a picture. It provides a mirror that we hold up to show people who we are and to understand who people are to us, right? So this is how we learn to differentiate between those people who like classical music and those people who like punk rock, right? We start to apply labels as us and them from the first moment we speak that language. More technical difficulties. And more technical difficulties. So, okay, that is working. So I, as an epidemiologist, I go out, I talk to people. I ask them questions. I turn their answers into numbers. I turn those numbers into dots on a graph. I run lines through those dots. And then I purport to tell people about those people I've interviewed, right? That's the language of epidemiology. But how is it possible that I could describe my good friend Nelson, right? An activist, a leader, a colleague, a friend, who is now, unfortunately, but a memory, right? I can't. And I struggled with this. I realized that I needed to undergo a transformation. I needed to become more honest with myself. I needed to understand what people like Divine, what people like Holly, what people like Laverne Cox go through, how they live their lives to be honest to themselves, and how they force people to understand who they are. And I needed to step into that in order to understand people and to do the kind of work I was proposing to do. I was pretending to do. See, I grew up in a very homogenized environment. I grew up on a dairy farm in northern New Jersey. And for me, I was the other in that community. I was a farmer in suburbia. I was a Jew in a predominantly Christian neighborhood. Right? I was the other. And yet, because I was white, I was also perceived as part of the us in that community. So I grew up with this dichotomy. For me, experiencing the other was getting on a bus, traveling 45 minutes down to 42nd Street, and cruising up and down 42nd Street past the gender benders, past the hustlers, past all the scam artists, the three-card monte players, and picturing myself as a character in a Lou Reed song. That, to me, was other. And in pursuit of trying to comprehend, I started moving around. I lived in Dhaka, I lived in Nairobi, I lived in Sao Paulo, I lived in Tunis, all doing all kinds of public health and other sorts of work. And I actually felt more at home in those communities than I did back in the neighborhood where I grew up, and also back in the community of researchers with whom I was working. right? These are the people who brought tears to my eyes. These are the people I felt I comprehended more intuitively, and yet I still refer to them as these people, right? There was still this dichotomy between us and them, and I was trying to overcome that. My first role at CDC, I still work, sort of, for the Centers for Disease Control in the US, where harm reduction was a bad word and may become a bad phrase again. Remains to be seen, right? So Steve Jones, who some of you may know, was the only person who talked about harm reduction back in the day, right? He sent me out to Iowa, where I sat in kitchens, on porches, in jail visiting rooms, interacting with meth heads. There was an outbreak of hepatitis A among methamphetamine users. And this was my first real experience. Yeah, I knew lots of drug users in college. We all did, right? But this was a different sort of person. These were not people who went to college. These were people who cooked and used, right? For me, this was eye-opening. For me, this is when I began to understand, to be able to look people in the eye and feel what they were feeling and actually try to step into their shoes. And Steve brought me back and he said, now it's time for you to become one of us. And he labeled me. He gave me my first stigmata, if you will. He put the scarlet KP for key population on my shirt and said, this is what you will do. And he altered the entire trajectory of my career. From that moment on, that's how I was perceived. And it was something I accepted. It was something I can't say that I craved it, but it was something I welcomed. And it was a place where I started to feel not only did I belong, but it was a place where I began to really understand the folks I was purporting to work with. And the most common question I would receive from my colleagues was, well, can't we just tag them all? You know, isn't there some way we can chip them and that's how we'll count them? I started my career in fisheries biology. Right? My first master's degree was in aquatic ecology. And to the folks I worked with, they saw people who inject as no different than salmon swimming upstream. Right? We can just tag their fins, and then we'll count them when they're caught. Right? To me, this was not acceptable. So I invited an active user down from Vancouver to speak at CDC. And the reaction was well, to say the least, there was a reaction, and it wasn't pleasant, right? How could you bring this guy in here who was talking about smoking crack last night, right? But he came in there, and he spoke. He got an audience, and he spoke, and he was so eloquent, so passionate, that whatever the fourth wall that the people in the room, the audience, had put up, it melted away within 20 minutes. Right? I saw my colleagues for the first time interacting with someone who all of a sudden was no longer a drug user, but was a person. And that the barrier we had to cross to get there was a little bit steep, but it was something that we were able to overcome. And that's part of the transformation that we need to start inculcating. Right? It's remarkable to me that the New York Times Magazine, who put these beautiful, strong sex workers on the cover of that national magazine and asked this question: how far have we come that we are able to do this? It seems a simple thing for us, but it wasn't, because if you think back 40 years ago, women were perceived as the demon. It was dirty, right? This is also a national magazine, New York Magazine. They had to clean up hell's bedroom, all right? This is how they portrayed sex work 40 years earlier. So I'm not sure where we're going after the last election, but this was the path we were on as recently as last summer, right? We have changed the conversation perceptibly. Now, I have to look back at our community of researchers and say we are part of the problem, because we portray different communities in terms of risk. We say this is our risk and this is their risk. This is us and this is them. And we take these mothers and daughters, these sons and fathers, these friends, these cousins, these aunts and uncles, and we put them in a box and we say, they're at higher risk. They have 50 times the risk of us. Right? That's creating a dichotomy that doesn't need to exist. So it's a question of language, because you see, we have data, and the data make it easy as pie for us to portray people as something other. And we have to learn to overcome that kind of language, because the language is also perception, and the perception becomes embedded, and it becomes action, and it becomes policy. And so it's not just about language. It's not just about hypersensitivity of people, which is all the talk in the US right now. I'm not sure if you're hearing it here in the UK as much. So we have an answer to this. As researchers, our community has an answer to this. And folks in this room, I think, understand this answer intuitively. We need to work with community. These sex workers were part of the research. They were there from the design of the work to the implementation, to the analysis and the reporting. They were part and parcel of everything that was done. And they are there to protect us from our own arrogance, from our own desire to feel like we alone can interpret what we're seeing. They bring meaning and depth to the numbers that become dots, that become lines, right? This is our critical need. This is why we all need each other. And we have to understand that everybody has something to contribute. And if we don't understand that, we will fail to interpret our data. We will fail to create action from that data. We will fail to create the action needed from that data in order to turn it into the kinds of successful programs that only work when we are all working together as one. Because however much we respect the data, and that's what we are constantly taught in school, respect the data. If I go out to a rural community and I start talking to the drug users in that community, how can I possibly understand the depth of their reality, the experience that they've undergone to get to where they're at, right? I can't. I have to be able to look people in the eye. I have to be able to hear their stories and understand their lived reality. And that's what's critical to this work. So I wish that as we go forward, we will be able to break bread with all of the members of our communities, of all the key population communities, and sit together and have our meals together and to do the work together to create the kinds of programs that we need together. And here, 10 years after my experience in Iowa, I'm sitting in a drug treatment center in Beijing, and I'm having this conversation with a woman in recovery, and I'm able to look her in the eye. I'm able to hear what she's saying. We're able to throw away the mirrors and just sing from the same song, that we are all children of the same humanity. And that's where we will have to go if we're going to really see an end to HIV and everything we're trying to do in our communities. So thank you.